The emergency room doors blew open at 11:47 p.m., and Ironwood Valley Medical Center stopped being a hospital. Three men moved through the entrance like they owned the building. Not panicked, not injured, not afraid. Purposeful. Within 90 seconds, the triage desk was overturned, a security guard was on the floor, and screaming had replaced the beeping of monitors. Staff scattered, patients pressed against walls, the PA system crackled and died. And in the middle of it, walking against the tide of everyone running out, was a nurse in dark scrubs, a retired military K-9 pressed close to her left leg, both of them moving like they had walked into worse. Nobody paid attention to her. That was the last mistake anyone in that building would make tonight. Before you go any further, if this story already has you holding your breath, hit subscribe and follow along to the end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The shift had started the way most Tuesday nights did at Ironwood Valley Medical Center, badly, and getting worse by the hour. Maya Caldwell clocked in at 6:58 p.m., 2 minutes before her shift technically began, which meant charge nurse Deborah Rice had already found something to complain about before Maya had even pulled her hair back. "You're late," Deborah said, not looking up from the scheduling board. "I'm 2 minutes early." "I needed you at 6:45. I sent a text." Maya checked her phone. The text had come in at 6:43. She'd been in the parking garage dealing with Atlas, who had decided that the smell coming from the dumpster near the stairwell required a full investigation. She had not responded to the text. She did not apologize for that now. "What do you need covered?" "Covered?" she asked instead. Deborah finally turned around. She was a thick-set woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead and the particular brand of exhausted authority that came from doing the same job for 20 years without being promoted any higher. She looked at Maya the way she always looked at Maya, like she was trying to solve an equation she didn't have the math for. Bed 7 is a hot mess. 42-year-old male, abdominal trauma, still waiting on Dr. Hargrove to finish his dinner break and authorize the CT. She paused. "And yes, I know. Don't say it." "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were making the face." Maya wasn't making a face. She had simply stopped emoting around Deborah 6 months ago because anything she showed on her face became a problem to be managed. She took the tablet Deborah was holding out and walked toward bed 7 without another word. The patient in bed 7 was a 51-year-old man named Gerald Okafor who had fallen from a loading dock and landed badly. He was pale, sweating, and had been waiting for imaging authorization for 47 minutes while his vitals quietly told a different story than the intake notes suggested. Maya took one look at his abdomen, the subtle distension, the rigidity when she pressed, the way he flinched and then tried to hide that he'd flinched. And she felt the specific low-grade alarm that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with having spent 4 years watching people pretend they were fine until they suddenly weren't. "Mr. Okafor," she said, pulling a stool close to the bed rather than standing over him, "on a scale of 1 to 10, and I want you to be honest with me, not polite." He managed a weak smile. 7? Maybe 8. "When did it go from a 7 to an 8? He thought about it. "About 20 minutes ago." She nodded, made a note, then walked directly to the nursing station and paged Dr. Hargrove. He called back 4 minutes later, his voice carrying the particular irritation of a man interrupted mid-meal. "Caldwell." "What?" "Gerald Okafor in bed 7. 47-minute delay on CT authorization. His abdomen is showing guarding and distension that wasn't documented on intake, and his pain has escalated in the last 20 minutes. I think we're looking at possible splenic involvement." A pause. "The intake notes say blunt abdominal trauma, stable vitals." "The intake notes were written 47 minutes ago." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be down in 10 minutes. "With respect, Dr. Hargrove, I don't think Mr. Okafor has 10 comfortable minutes." The silence on the line went cold. "Are you telling me how to practice medicine, Nurse Caldwell?" "I'm telling you what I'm observing in front of me right now." He hung up. He did come down, but it was 14 minutes later, not 10, and he spent the first 2 of those minutes reviewing the intake notes rather than examining the patient, which Maya watched from the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression locked down tight. When Hargrove finally pressed the patient's abdomen and Gerald Okafor gasped, The doctor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He ordered the CT without looking at Maya. The scan showed a grade 3 splenic laceration. Hargrove walked past Maya on his way to coordinate surgical consult and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Lucky guess." She didn't respond. She went back to bed 7 and stayed with Mr. Okafor until the surgical team arrived, because she had learned a long time ago that being right didn't mean anyone was going to say so. Atlas was in the break room. This was technically a violation of hospital policy. Animals were not permitted beyond the staff entrance except as certified therapy or service animals. Atlas was a retired military working dog, a German shepherd with a dark saddle and one slightly torn ear from an incident in a country Maya didn't talk about publicly. He was not certified as a therapy animal. He was certified as nothing, officially, because his actual certifications were classified at a level that a community hospital's HR department was not equipped to process. Maya had brought him to work exactly 3 times in the past year, each time during overnight shifts when the break room was quieter and the charge nurse on duty was someone other than Deborah. The other nurses had figured out early on not to ask too many questions about Atlas, partly because he was exceptionally well-behaved, and partly because there was something in the way Maya talked about him, or more precisely, didn't talk about him, that signaled the subject had edges. He was lying under the break room table when she came in at 9:15 to eat something before the second wave of the evening hit. She dropped into a chair, put her feet up on the opposite seat, and tore open a granola bar with her teeth, while Atlas rested his chin on her boot. "You smell that dumpster all over yourself," she told him. He didn't deny it. She ate in silence for a few minutes, listening to the low hum of the vending machine and the distant sounds of the emergency department doing what emergency departments did after 9 p.m., filling up with the consequences of other people's decisions. Somewhere down the hall, someone was crying. Somewhere else, someone was arguing with a triage nurse about wait times. She had been at Ironwood Valley for 14 months. She had come here after a transition period that she'd told the hiring committee was about finding a pace of life that worked for her, which was true in the sense that it contained no outright lies. The fuller truth was that she had spent 11 years in the Army as a special operations combat medic, had operated as a trauma specialist attached to units doing work that she couldn't describe in a job interview, and had come home to find that none of that translated cleanly into civilian life. Her discharge had been honorable. Her record was largely classified. Her skill set was immense and entirely invisible to people who hadn't worked in the environments where it had been built. She had taken the nursing position at Ironwood Valley because it was a job, because Atlas was adjusting better with structure, and because she was not ready to stop doing work that mattered. She had not expected to be good at it. She had turned out to be exceptional at it, in ways that the people around her found alternately impressive and threatening, depending on their own relationship with competence. She finished the granola bar, gave Atlas the last third of it, and went back to the floor. At 10:12 p.m., Dr. Hargrove did something that crossed a line. The patient in question was a young woman, 24 years old, presenting with what had been logged as a migraine, but whose medication list and the particular way she was holding her neck had put Maya on alert from the moment she read the chart. Maya had flagged the attending on duty, not Hargrove, and requested a neurology consult. The attending, a younger physician named Dr. Solis, had agreed it was worth a closer look. Hargrove had come over, uninvited, technically, reviewed the chart, and overridden the consult request with a note that said, "Migraine Management Protocol, consult not indicated." He had done this without examining the patient. Maya had stood at the nursing station and read the override note twice. Then she had walked to Dr. Solis and said, very quietly, "Can I get your read on something?" Dr. Solis had looked at the override, looked at the chart, and had the decency to look uncomfortable. "He's seen you're attending tonight." He didn't examine her. "I know. Her neck rigidity is new. It wasn't there on intake." "Maya, I'm not asking you to fight with him. I'm asking if you agree with the clinical picture." He hadn't answered her directly. He had walked away, and Maya had understood that the conversation was over in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. She went back to the patient's room. The young woman's name was Priya Anand, and she was the kind of patient who apologized for existing in a hospital bed, quiet, polite, clearly trying not to make a fuss. Maya sat down beside her and asked the kind of careful, specific questions that didn't sound like what they were. She found what she was looking for in about 4 minutes. When she went back to Hargrove directly, which she knew was going to cost her something, she kept her voice level and her eyes steady. Dr. Hargrove, Miss Anand in bed 3. Her neutral rigidity has progressed. She's reporting photophobia. She didn't mention on intake, and her fever is now 101.4. I need you to reconsider the consult. He looked at her for a long moment. There were 2 other nurses nearby. He did not lower his voice. Nurse Caldwell, I have reviewed that chart. The patient has a known migraine history. The symptoms you're describing are consistent with a severe migraine episode. I understand that your experience in... He paused, the way people paused when they wanted the pause itself to mean something. Whatever it was you did before this gave you a certain confidence in making assessments. But you are a floor nurse. Your job is to administer care, not diagnose. The 2 nearby nurses had gone very still. I'm not diagnosing, Maya said. I'm flagging clinical changes, which I have reviewed and determined do not warrant an additional consult. His voice was pleasant in the way that expensive knives were pleasant to look at. Thank you, Nurse Caldwell. That'll be all. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, not long enough to be in subordination, long enough to make sure he understood she was choosing to walk away. And then she went back to the nursing station and documented every clinical observation she had made, time-stamped, in detail, because she had learned that documentation was the thing that outlasted everything else. At 10:41, Priya Anand's condition deteriorated sharply. The neurology team that was finally called agreed within minutes. Bacterial meningitis, caught late. Too late for easy treatment, not late enough for the worst outcome. But the window had been narrower than it should have been. Hargrove, in the hallway outside the room with his arms crossed, said to the charge nurse, not to Maya, "Someone on this floor has been playing doctor tonight. I want it documented." Deborah Rice looked at Maya. Maya looked back at her. "I'll make a note," Deborah said. The conversation with hospital administration happened the next morning, which was a Thursday, which seemed like an inappropriate day for someone's professional life to get complicated. Director of Nursing Services, Patricia Vole, had an office on the 4th floor that smelled like lavender plugins and had motivational posters on the walls that Maya had to stop looking at because they made her feel genuinely strange. Patricia Vole was 58, administrative rather than clinical, and had the manner of someone who had learned to handle conflict by softening every sharp thing until it no longer had a point. "Maya," she said, as if they were friends. They were not. "Thank you for coming in." "You asked me to be here at 9, Maya said. "It's 9. "Yes, of course." Patricia folded her hands on her desk. "I want to talk about last night." "Which part?" A small pause. "Dr. Hargrove has raised some concerns about a pattern of, let's call it overreach. Not just last night, but across several incidents over recent months." "Can you be specific about the incidents?" Patricia opened a folder. "The Okafor situation. A conflict in February regarding pain management protocols in the surgical prep unit. A. Disagreement with nursing administration about documentation standards in March." She looked up. "Are these familiar?" "Yes. In all 3 cases, I flagged clinical concerns that were subsequently validated." "The concern isn't whether you were right, Maya." Patricia said it gently, like she was explaining something to someone who couldn't quite grasp it. "The concern is how you handled it, bypassing the chain of command, undermining physician authority in front of patients and staff. I've never undermined anyone in front of a patient. Dr. Hargrove humiliated me in front of 2 colleagues while overriding a legitimate clinical flag. I did not respond to that in a way that compromised patient care." Patricia's expression didn't change, which told Maya that she had already decided what this meeting was going to conclude before Maya walked in. "We value your work here," Patricia said. "We do. But the feedback from Dr. Hargrove and from your direct supervisor has raised concerns about your ability to function within the collaborative framework that this hospital requires." She paused. "I'm going to recommend a formal performance review. In the interim, Dr. Hargrove has requested that you not be assigned to the primary emergency bay. He's removing me from the ER. He's requesting adjusted placement. He's removing me from the ER because I was right, and he doesn't want to be reminded of it every shift." Patricia's hands tightened slightly on the folder. "Maya, I understand this is frustrating, but I need you to hear what I'm saying. If this pattern continues, we're going to be having a different kind of conversation." Maya looked at the motivational posters. One of them said, "Teamwork makes the dream work," in large sans serif letters over a photograph of mountain climbers. She thought about what the mountain climbers would do if one of them told the others there was a crack in the ice ahead, and the team leader said, "Thank you, I'll take it under advisement. Please move to a different position on the rope." She stood up. "I'll wait for the formal review notification," she said. "In writing." She walked out. She went to the parking garage and sat in her car for 11 minutes, with Atlas's head in her lap and her hands not quite steady on his fur. She wasn't going to cry. She hadn't cried about a work situation since a place she'd been deployed to that she also wasn't going to think about right now. She was angry, which was cleaner than crying and more useful, and she was trying to decide what to do with the anger in a way that didn't destroy something she still needed. The honest truth, the one she hadn't said to Patricia Vole, the one she barely said to herself, was that she didn't know what she would do if she left nursing. The job was hard, and the environment was broken, and the people who were supposed to support her seemed most comfortable when she made herself smaller. But the actual work, the moment of contact between what she knew and what someone needed, that was the only thing in the last 2 years that had felt like solid ground under her feet. Atlas made a low sound and pressed his head up into her palm. "Yeah," she said, "I know." She went back inside at the start of her next shift. She did not hear the first sound of it until 11:37 p.m., and by then it had already begun. It started as vibration more than sound, a concussive thump from somewhere in the direction of the main entrance that she felt in her chest before she heard it, followed immediately by the particular quality of silence that falls right before a room full of people start screaming. Maya was at the nursing station in the secondary triage hall, 50 feet from the main emergency bay, when the sound hit. She put down the chart she was holding. Atlas, who had been lying against the wall behind her. She had brought him tonight, during this shift, because she'd been on since noon and the overnight stretch with him nearby was better than without. Raised his head. The screaming started. It came from the main bay, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by voices. Men's voices. Not panicked, not in pain, which was the wrong sound for an emergency room, and her body knew it before her mind caught up. She did not run. Running was for people who didn't know yet what was on the other side of the next corner. She moved to the edge of the secondary hall doorway and looked through the reinforced glass panel in the door. What she saw in the main bay lasted approximately 4 seconds before someone hit the lights. 3 men, not patients, moving through the entrance bay with a kind of geometric efficiency that you didn't get from street crime or random violence. One toward the security desk, one toward the doors that led to the hospital's administrative corridor. One, and this was the one that locked something in her chest, holding position near the main patient intake, where there were still 8 or 9 people who had been waiting since before the shift change. The security guard, Marcus, a 23-year-old who had been at the hospital 6 months, and whose greatest professional crisis before tonight had been a drunk patient in October, was on the floor. Not dead. She could see him breathing from here. But down. Atlas was at her knee. She could feel him vibrating at a frequency that wasn't quite sound. She pulled back from the doorway and thought for exactly 10 seconds. Not about whether to act, about how. She did not reach for her phone to call security first. Security was already down. She did not go looking for Dr. Hargrove or Patricia Vole or anyone who had told her in the last 24 hours that she didn't know how to function within a collaborative framework. She sent a single text to a number she had memorized, not stored, using a phrase that meant something specific to exactly one person who was not in this hospital. Then she clipped Atlas's working lead. Not his regular collar lead, his other one, the nylon and hardware one she'd been carrying in her bag for 8 months out of habit and never thought she'd need. And she did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She went to work. The first thing she needed to establish was the shape of it. 3 visible figures in the main bay. But the man who had gone toward the administrative corridor had already moved out of her sightline, which meant there were at least 2 blind spots she needed to account for before she could understand what she was actually dealing with. The equipment they were carrying, she'd seen it in 4 seconds of low light, but 4 seconds was enough. Wasn't what she would have expected for a robbery or a hostage situation. No visible weapons displayed for effect. Whatever they were carrying was compact, purpose-built, and not for show. This was not about money. She moved through the secondary hall, keeping Atlas close, and found the junction corridor that connected to the radiology suite, and, beyond it, the hospital's network infrastructure room. She knew this building the way she'd learned to know every building she'd spent significant time in: exit points, structural cover, lines of sight, where the cameras were and what they covered, and, more importantly, what they didn't. She'd done this without thinking about why she was doing it. Old habits didn't announce themselves. At the junction, she ran into Felicity Obi, one of the night shift technicians, backed against the wall with both hands over her mouth and her eyes showing white at the edges. "How many people are still in the main bay?" Maya asked. Felicity blinked. "What?" "Patients, staff. Who's still in the main bay?" I don't... There were people waiting, maybe 8, and Dr. Solis was on, and the 2 night nurses, and... Is there anyone in radiology right now? Petra went in about 20 minutes ago. She's probably still... Go to the radiology suite, lock the door from the inside. Do not use the phone in there. Do you have your personal cell? Felicity nodded. Text Petra before you get there so the door's already open. Text the ER supervisor line, not the main desk, the supervisor line, and tell them the main bay is compromised. Don't call 911 because it's already going to be called and you'll jam the line. She met Felicity's eyes. Can you do those things? Felicity looked at Atlas, then at Maya, and something in her expression shifted from raw panic to something smaller and more manageable. Yes, she said. Good. Go. Felicity went. Atlas made a sound at Maya's left knee. Not quite a growl, more a change in his breathing that she recognized. He had caught something. She didn't know what yet, but she knew better than to override it. She followed him. He led her, at a controlled pace, down the left junction corridor, past the supply room, and stopped at the door to the medical records annex, a room that had been, until 3 months ago, primarily used for paper filing before the system conversion, and that was now largely empty except for server hardware that had not yet been relocated to the new record system. The door was closed. The light beneath it was wrong. Someone was inside. She held Atlas's lead in her left hand and pressed her back to the wall beside the door and thought about the text she had sent and how long it would take and whether that mattered right now. The door opened from the inside. The man who came through it was not one of the 3 she'd seen in the bay. He was moving quickly, carrying something flat and electronic, and he didn't see her until he was already in the corridor and she had already made the decision about how this was going to go. What followed was not graceful. Real things rarely were. Atlas hit first, controlled, targeted, exactly the way he'd been trained, going for the arm that was carrying the equipment rather than anything vital. Maya was 2 steps behind, and the equipment hit the floor, and the man was loud for about 4 seconds before he wasn't. She had zip ties in her bag. She had carried them for 8 months out of the same habit that had kept the working lead clipped to the inner pocket. She was still zip-tying his wrists when Atlas raised his head and looked toward the far end of the corridor, the part that connected back to the main bay. Something had changed. She didn't know what yet, but Atlas knew, and the way he was looking told her it had gotten worse. She finished the knot, checked it twice, and stood. Down the corridor, through the fire door's small rectangular window, she could see into the main bay. She could see the patient still against the wall. She could see one of the 3 men talking on a phone, which meant he was reporting to someone. She could also see, now that her eyes had adjusted and she knew what she was looking at, the thing she had missed the first time. The man holding position near the intake. He wasn't watching the patients. He was watching the corridor that led to the hospital's administrative wing, specifically the door at the end of it. Behind that door was the office suite that housed, among other things, the hospital's central records system and its security infrastructure terminal, the single point from which every camera, every locked door, every alarm in Ironwood Valley Medical Center could be accessed or disabled. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a hostage situation. It was a breach, a deliberate, coordinated infrastructure breach, using the chaos in the emergency bay as cover, and she was the only person in the building who had figured it out. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. 1 line of text from the number she hadn't stored. 12 minutes. She put the phone away, looked at Atlas, and thought about 12 minutes and everything that could happen inside a building in 12 minutes when you were the only thing standing between the people who'd planned this and what they'd come to get. Okay, she said quietly. Atlas looked up at her. We've got 12 minutes. She moved before the 12 minutes became 11. The corridor ahead split into two directions, left toward the administrative wing and the records infrastructure room, right back toward the secondary triage hall where she'd come from. The man on the floor behind her wasn't going anywhere. The equipment he'd been carrying was a compact wireless relay device, the kind used to mirror and extract data from a network server without triggering the standard breach alerts. She had left it where it fell because picking it up would tell her less than leaving it told her. Whoever had sent him would expect him to reappear at a specific time with a specific signal, and when neither happened, they would adjust. She had maybe 9 minutes now before they adjusted. She went left. Atlas moved with her at a tight heel, his nails soundless on the linoleum in a way that still surprised her even after years together. He had been trained by people who understood that noise was a liability, and the training had settled into his body so completely that even on a leash he moved like something that hadn't decided yet whether to exist. The administrative corridor was dim, running on the overnight lighting that cast everything in that particular institutional yellow that made even healthy people look sick. There were 4 doors on the left side and 2 on the right. Maya had walked this corridor exactly once, during her second week at the hospital, as part of an orientation tour that had included approximately 4 minutes in the administrative wing before the tour guide had steered everyone back toward the clinical areas because, she'd said cheerfully, this part is mostly just paperwork. She had spent those 4 minutes the way she spent every unfamiliar space, mapping it. Not deliberately, not as a conscious exercise. It had become a reflex so deeply embedded that she didn't notice she was doing it until she needed it, and then it was just there, like knowing which direction was north. The door at the end of the corridor was the one she needed. It had a keypad lock, which she had noted during the tour because keypad locks on interior hospital doors were unusual, and the tour guide hadn't explained why it was there, which meant it was worth knowing about. She stopped 15 feet from the door and listened. Nothing from the other side. Which could mean the corridor was still clear, or could mean whoever was heading for that door hadn't arrived yet, or could mean they were already inside and had been inside long enough to get quiet. Atlas's ears had gone forward, not a threat posture, interest. Something on the other side of that door was generating a smell that warranted attention. She made a decision that she immediately wasn't sure about, which was par for the situation. She went back down the corridor and tried the second door on the left. It was unlocked. Supply closet, cleaning equipment, paper goods, a shelf of miscellaneous office supplies. She pulled a fire evacuation map from the inside of the door, a laminated card about the size of a folded letter, and looked at it in the low light. The administrative suite was larger than she'd registered from the outside. 4 connected rooms, including the main office, a server room, a communications hub, and a records annex that was separate from the one she'd already cleared. The server room had 2 entry points, the keypad door in the main corridor and a secondary access door that connected through the communications hub. She put the map back and went to the communications hub door instead, which was 3 doors down from the keypad entrance and was, unlike the other door, not locked with a keypad. It was, however, locked with a standard key, which was not her key. She stood in front of it for 2 seconds, thought about the 8 people still in the main bay, thought about 12 minutes becoming 8, thought about the fact that Atlas was pulling very slightly toward the keypad door now, which meant the smell had intensified, which meant the situation on the other side was developing. Then she took the small multi-tool from her scrub's pocket. She carried it the way she carried the zip ties and the lead, out of habit, because she had once spent 11 days in an environment where the difference between having a multi-tool and not having one had been the difference between a problem and a catastrophe. And she did something to the door lock that she had learned in a context she couldn't discuss, and that took her 47 seconds, and was absolutely not part of any nursing certification program she'd ever encountered. The door opened. The communications hub was a narrow room lined with equipment racks, routers, patch panels, the physical backbone of the hospital's internal network. It smelled like electronics and recycled air, and underneath that, something else. Sweat. Recent human occupation. Someone had been in this room within the last 20 minutes. She moved through it carefully, Atlas at her leg, scanning the equipment as she passed. Nothing had been visibly tampered with in this room. The target was the server room on the other side. She could see the connecting door from here. It was slightly ajar. Light spilling through the gap, warm, artificial, and moving slightly. The glow of active screens. She stopped, listened, heard breathing. One person, moving around a confined space. Not frantically, not calmly either. The particular rhythm of someone working under time pressure, focused enough that they hadn't heard her come through from the communications hub. She looked at Atlas. He looked back at her. She gave a hand signal she hadn't used in 2 years, and he went flat and still against the equipment rack, lead slack. Then she went through the connecting door. The man inside the server room was 30-something, wearing dark clothing, crouched in front of an open server rack with a laptop balanced on the edge of the rack beside him, and 3 separate cable connections running from the laptop into the server hardware. He had his back to her. He was typing fast. He heard her when she was 4 feet away, which was too late, and he turned, and the expression on his face went through 3 phases in about 1 second. Surprise, assessment, then a specific kind of recalculation that she recognized as someone deciding that the person in front of them was not a threat. She was a woman in nursing scrubs. He weighed at least 60 pounds more than her. He had been in worse situations than this. "Wrong room," he said. "Wrong building," she said. He lunged. What happened next took 11 seconds and left Maya with a bruised elbow, a torn pocket, and a data cable clutched in her left hand, one of the 3 he'd had connected to the server. It left him with significantly more problems, including a dislocated shoulder, the weight of Atlas on his chest, and the end of a zip tie cutting into his wrists behind his back. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her elbow was going to be spectacular tomorrow. She looked at the laptop screen. He'd gotten into the system. She could see that much from the file directory that was open. But the transfer status bar was at 11%, which meant either the files were large or he hadn't had long enough, and either way, 11% was not complete. She pulled the remaining 2 data cables. The transfer stopped. She didn't touch anything else. Evidence was evidence, and she'd learned that contaminating a scene felt satisfying for approximately 3 seconds and caused problems for approximately 3 years afterward. Her phone buzzed. The same number. "Where are you?" She typed back. "Administrative server room. 1 secured. Data transfer incomplete. Stopped at 11%. At least 2 more in the main bay, 1 additional unaccounted." She sent it and looked at the man on the floor. He was conscious, breathing, furious in a contained way that told her this wasn't his first professional setback. "What are you taking?" she asked. He said nothing. "The security infrastructure data. The camera grid, the door access logs, patient record authentication." She watched his face. Not for a response, for confirmation. She found it in the way his jaw shifted slightly when she said authentication. "That's the piece that doesn't make sense yet. You don't need patient records if this is about the facility systems." Still nothing. "There's a federal data protection contract tied to this hospital," she said, more to herself than to him. "The records authentication system is the bridge between this hospital's network and the regional health security database." His face didn't change, but his breathing did. "Okay," she said quietly. She had been treating this as a targeted facility breach. It was bigger than that. Oh, her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. Felicity. "Petra says there's a man in the hallway outside radiology. Not staff. Not doing anything, just standing there." Maya stared at the message. A 4th man, standing outside the room she'd sent Felicity and Petra into. She typed back, "Do not open the door. Do not make noise. Radiology has a secondary exit through the imaging corridor. Do you know it?" A long pause. "Yes, use it. Go to the staff lounge on 3. Lock the door." Okay, going." She put the phone away. The man on the floor was watching her with the steady attention of someone cataloging information for later use, which meant he expected there to be a later, which meant his people had a contingency. She had given his colleagues approximately 6 minutes before they were going to know something had gone wrong. She went back through the communications hub and into the administrative corridor and moved toward the main bay door, keeping close to the wall, because the decision she'd made without quite making it was that she needed to know what was happening with the people in that bay. She got within 10 feet of the fire door and stopped. Through the small rectangular window, she could see the main bay from a slightly different angle than before. The intake waiting area was on her right, the nurses' station in the center, the trauma bays along the left wall. The 8 people she'd counted before were still there, ranged along the far wall in a rough cluster. Some of them were sitting. One was standing with her arms wrapped around herself. One, an older man who had clearly come in before all of this started, was still holding a number ticket from the intake queue. The two men who were still in the bay were positioned in a way that was not random. One was near the entrance, one was near the interior corridor door. They were containing the space, not searching it, which meant they were buying time for something, which meant the thing they were buying time for was either already done or in progress. She had stopped the transfer in the server room. If that was the primary objective, they were going to know very soon that they had a problem. Unless the server room wasn't the primary objective. She pulled back from the door and stood in the corridor and ran through what she knew, in the order she knew it. 3 men in the main bay, coordinated entry, security disabled immediately. 1 man in the medical records annex carrying a wireless relay. 1 man in the server room with direct cable access to the server hardware. 1 man stationed outside radiology. 4 men. 4 separate locations. 4 simultaneous actions. But a wireless relay and a direct cable access were redundant. You didn't need both to pull data from the same system, unless they weren't targeting the same system. The medical records annex wasn't connected to the administrative server. It ran on a separate legacy system that hadn't been fully migrated yet, a fact she knew only because she'd overheard a facilities technician complaining about it in the break room 2 weeks ago. The relay device that the man in the annex had been carrying was designed for wireless extraction from a local, isolated network. 2 systems, 2 extraction teams, 1 in the administrative server network, 1 in the legacy record system. And the man outside radiology, she looked at the evacuation map in her memory and placed the radiology suite relative to the rest of the building. Radiology was directly adjacent to the imaging data archive. The imaging archive that stored the hospital's complete diagnostic imaging history and its associated patient identification metadata. 3 systems, 3 teams, 3 extractions running simultaneously. She had stopped one. The others were still running. The phone buzzed. The first number, 2 minutes. North service entrance, 2 minutes. She looked at the fire door window. 2 men in the bay, 8 civilians, and whatever was happening in the imaging archive right now that she had no visibility on. She made a list in her head, not a real list, the kind she used to make in the field when she needed to triage decisions the way you triaged patients, by what was going to fail fastest if she didn't address it. The civilians in the main bay were contained but not yet in danger of physical harm. The imaging archive extraction was ongoing, and she had no current way to reach it without going through the main bay or back through the administrative corridor and down a route she hadn't mapped. The server room extraction was stopped, but the man was still there and could potentially restart if someone freed him. And in 2 minutes, whoever was coming through the north service entrance was either going to change everything or end everything, and she didn't know which yet. She went to find Marcus. Marcus Trent was conscious, which she had known from a distance, but conscious turned out to mean propped against the base of the security desk, with his head between his knees and a cut above his eyebrow that had bled impressively down the side of his face, and was now drying into the particular rust color that always looked worse than it was. She reached him by going through the auxiliary access, a connecting passage used for equipment transfers that ran parallel to the main bay and had a door at each end. It wasn't invisible, but it kept her out of the direct sightline of the 2 men still in the bay, and she moved quietly enough that she was crouched beside Marcus before either of them looked her way. "Hey," she said quietly. "Marcus, look at me." He lifted his head, his eyes tracked. Concussion possible, serious TBI unlikely. The quality of his gaze, confused but present, told her what she needed to know. "I need you to listen carefully," she said. "Nod if you can hear me." He nodded, winced. "The security feed room. Is it still accessible from the subdesk terminal?" He blinked. Yeah, it should be. They didn't go down there. I don't think they... Where's the terminal?" "Under the desk. Second panel on the left." "Is there a silent alarm on the system? Something that doesn't trigger in the main room?" It's the blue button under the panel. Goes directly to the county sheriff's dispatch. It's for..." He paused, pressing his eyes shut for a second. "It's for if someone takes the main system. It bypasses the building alarm." "Has anyone hit it?" "No, I was trying to when they..." He stopped. "Okay." She looked at him carefully. "I need you to not move from this position. Can you do that?" "I want to I know, not yet." She looked at the 2 men across the bay. Neither had moved. "The cavalry is 90 seconds out. I need you conscious and stable when they arrive so you can open the service door from the inside. Who are you bringing in? She had already started moving toward the sub-desk panel. People who are going to have a lot of questions about why this building wasn't harder to get into, she said. She found the panel, found the blue button, and pressed it. It made no sound in the room. Somewhere in the county dispatch system, a light was blinking. She came back up behind the desk and stayed low and looked across the main bay. The two men were talking to each other now. Low, brief, the kind of exchange that signals an adjustment to a plan. The one near the interior door had his hand in his jacket pocket. The one near the entrance was looking toward the corridor that led to the administrative wing. They knew something was wrong. She had maybe 30 seconds before they decided to do something about it. Atlas was still in the server room corridor. She needed him here, but bringing him through the main bay wasn't a move she could make alone without changing the entire situation in ways she couldn't fully control. She looked at the exits, looked at the civilians, and thought about the specific geometry of this moment. The distance between the two men and the patients, the distance between the entrance and where she was, the distance between right now and 30 seconds. Then she did something that was either very smart or very stupid, which in her experience usually meant it was the right call at the wrong time. She stood up. Not all the way up. Enough to be visible above the desk line, enough that one of the two men glanced toward her on reflex. He registered her. Scrubs, nursing, wrong location. And the recalculation happened in his face the same way it had happened with the man in the server room. She used the moment while he was still deciding what she was. Everybody against the left wall, she said. Not loudly, firmly. The particular tone of voice she had used in field triage when she needed 12 people to move in a specific direction and had approximately 4 seconds to make it happen. Move now, left wall. The civilians moved. Humans in crisis respond to confidence the way they respond to oxygen, hungrily, without analyzing the source. The man near the entrance started toward her. The north service door opened. What came through it wasn't what any of the men in that room had been prepared for. She had sent a text to a number she hadn't stored to a person she hadn't spoken to in 14 months, and the text had contained 6 words that were not words in any conventional sense, but which that person had understood immediately and completely because they had written the meaning of those 6 words together in a context that neither of them ever talked about in polite company. Special Agent Dara Winslow was 41, former Army, currently attached to a federal task force that Maya did not have a security clearance to know the full scope of, though she had been able to infer most of it from 2 years of working alongside Dara in circumstances that had not been pleasant. Dara was 5'6" and built like someone who had decided early in life that she was not interested in being underestimated twice by the same person. She came through the north service door with 3 other people who moved the way she moved, efficiently, without theater, scanning the room in the standard pattern that told Maya they had been briefed on the layout in the 90 seconds they'd had to prepare. The man who had been moving toward Maya stopped. Dara looked at him. Down, she said. He didn't go down immediately, which was a decision he had about 3 seconds to reconsider before he went down. The second man, near the interior corridor door, made a different calculation and moved toward the patient cluster. It was a bad move that he probably knew was bad, but made anyway because it was the only play he had left. And it lasted approximately as long as it took Maya to get from behind the desk to the space between him and the nearest patient, which was a woman in her 40s who had been sitting with her arms around a child who was probably 7 years old. Don't, Maya said. He looked at her. She looked back. Atlas appeared at the corridor door behind her, lead trailing, and sat. The man's shoulders dropped. The bay was secured in the following 4 minutes without anyone else getting hurt, which was not the same as everything being okay, but was the necessary prerequisite for anything being okay later. Dara Winslow found Maya standing next to Marcus, who was now sitting upright against the security desk with a trauma dressing on his forehead that Maya had applied from the kit behind the desk, and Dara did not say hello or how are you or anything that acknowledged the 14 months since the last time they'd been in the same room. You said 3 systems, Dara said. The imaging archive is the 3rd one. I don't know if the extraction completed. We've got someone going there now. Dara looked at the corridor toward the administrative wing. The server room? 1 secured. Transfer stopped at 11%. The annex? 1 secured. Relay device on the floor. Dara was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when she was running through the implications of a situation and didn't yet have all the numbers. "What are they after, Winslow?" Maya asked. Dara looked at her. "You know I can't—" "Don't." Maya's voice was level, but there was something underneath it that Dara, who had known her for 6 years, recognized as the sound of a person who had just had a very long night on top of a very long year and was not in the mood. "Don't tell me you can't tell me. I stopped 2 out of 3 extractions, and I need to know if there's a 4th element I'm not seeing." Dara held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Patient authentication data, the kind that ties to a federal protected witness program." Maya stared at her. "There are 3 people currently admitted to this hospital under protected identities," Dara said. "If that authentication data gets out, 3 people, in this building, right now." "Yes." Maya thought about the man outside radiology. The 4th man. The one she'd redirected Felicity and Petra away from. The one who had been standing and watching, not extracting, not yet. Waiting for the data to tell him something. Waiting for a patient identity to resolve into a room number. "The imaging archive," she said. "What about it?" "Diagnostic imaging data includes admission records. If the archive extraction completed, they already have what they need. They don't need the authentication data from the server. They can cross-reference the imaging records against the protected identity flags and narrow it to 3 rooms." Dara had already turned, already moving, already speaking into her earpiece. Maya was moving too, in a different direction. She knew where the protected rooms were going to be. Not because she had access to that information, but because she had been a nurse at this hospital for 14 months, and she knew which rooms were which. And more importantly, she had passed one room twice in the last month during rounds that had struck her as wrong in a way she hadn't been able to name. The room that was always too quiet, always staffed by the same 2 people, always had the same car parked outside in the visitor lot. Room 14, East Wing. She was running now. Atlas was running beside her. Behind her, she could hear Dara's voice in the corridor, sharp and urgent, and beneath it the sound of the emergency department beginning, slowly and painfully, to breathe again. Ahead of her, the East Wing corridor stretched away under the overnight lights, yellow and still and quiet. Too quiet. The door to room 14 was open. The door to room 14 was open, and that was wrong in 3 different ways. Hospital rooms with protected occupants didn't have open doors at midnight. The overnight nursing protocol for the East Wing required doors to be pulled to within 6 inches of closed between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. She knew this because she had covered East Wing twice during shift shortages and had been corrected about it both times by the same charge nurse. And the particular quality of the silence coming from inside that room was not the silence of someone sleeping. It was the silence of a space that had recently been vacated. She went in anyway. The bed was empty. Not just unoccupied, stripped down to the mattress, the monitor leads coiled neatly on the bedside table, the IV pole standing bare in the corner. Whoever had been in this room had been moved, and moved in a hurry, because the water cup was still on the rolling tray table, and there was a phone charger still plugged into the wall socket beside the bed. Atlas circled the room once and came back to her side without alerting on anything. Whoever had been here was gone and had left nothing worth following. She pulled out her phone and typed to Dara. "Room 14 cleared, patient moved. Not by the intruders. Looks like a fast evac. Do you have eyes on where they went?" The response came in 20 seconds. "Confirmed. Our people moved all 3 patients when the breach alarm went up. They're in a secured location off-site. East Wing is clear." She let out a breath that she hadn't realized she'd been holding for about the last 6 minutes. Then the second part of Dara's message came through. "But we have a problem in the imaging archive. Get back here." The imaging archive was on the basement level, accessible from 2 stairwells and an elevator that had been shut down as part of the building. Lockdown protocols that had kicked in, late and only partially, when the main security system had finally registered what was happening. Maya took the east stairwell because it was faster and because she didn't trust the elevator not to stop on the wrong floor, and she was through the basement door and in the archive corridor within 90 seconds of leaving room 14. The archive room itself was at the end of a corridor that smelled like old paper and server coolant, which was the particular combination of smells that came from a room that had been designed for one era of record-keeping and repurposed for another without anyone wanting to spend the money to do it properly. The door was open. Also wrong. Also recently. Dara was inside with one of the agents who had come through the North Service entrance. There was a laptop on the archive workstation that did not belong there, and the man who had been operating it was on the floor, not restrained this time, and not from anything Maya's team had done. He was unconscious, and his breathing was wrong. She crossed to him in 4 steps and dropped to one knee. His color was off, grayish, with a sweated sheen, pulse rapid and thready. Pupils when she pulled an eyelid, unequal, left larger than right by a margin that made her jaw tighten. "How long has he been down?" she asked. "We found him like this," the agent said. 2 minutes ago, maybe 3. "Did anyone touch him? Move him?" "No." She ran her hands along the back of his skull, found the contusion on the right side, and felt the particular give of the bone beneath that told her this was worse than it looked from the outside. "He hit something," she said, "or something hit him." She looked around the room. The corner of the workstation desk had blood on it, dark, not fresh, but recent. "He went down hard. This isn't a minor head injury. Can you stabilize him?" She was already reaching for her phone to call up to the ER, because stabilizing was a clinical team situation, not a one-nurse-on-the-floor situation, and because she knew what an epidural bleed looked like when it was developing, and she did not want to be the only person in the room when this one declared itself. "I can manage him until I get a team down here. I need a trauma cart and a neurology consult, and I need them in the next 4 minutes. Get someone on the line." She looked at Dara. "And I need to know if this was one of theirs or something else." "His ID matches one of the 4 we identified," Dara said. "He's part of the original crew." "So he fell during the extraction. That's the working assumption. Okay?" She turned her full attention back to the man on the floor, because whatever he had done tonight, the fact of his injury existed outside the question of his guilt, and her job was not contingent on either. She positioned him carefully, maintained his airway, and kept 2 fingers on his wrist while she talked the ER charge nurse through the situation on speakerphone in a voice that was steady in the way voices got steady when the alternative wasn't productive. The trauma cart arrived in 6 minutes, not 4, because the elevator was still in partial lockdown and the team had to take the stairs. She didn't comment on the time when they arrived. She just gave them the handoff, mechanism of injury, duration of unconsciousness, neurosigns, vitals trend, in 30 seconds flat, the way she'd learned to give handoffs in conditions where 30 seconds was a luxury. The lead trauma physician, a woman named Dr. Ewan, who Maya had worked with once before and found competent in the specific way that some people were competent entirely without warmth, listened to the handoff and then said, looking at the patient, "Suspected epidural hematoma? Presentation is consistent. We'll need CT immediately." "He'll need to be cleared by the federal agents first," Maya said. Dr. Ewan looked at Dara. Dara nodded. Dr. Ewan made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite an acknowledgement and started directing her team. Maya stepped back and let them work. The next 40 minutes were a specific kind of difficult that she hadn't experienced before. Not in the field, not in any training exercise, not in 14 months at Ironwood Valley. The clinical emergency was manageable. The logistical chaos of a hospital in partial lockdown, with federal agents in 3 locations, 4 suspects in various states of custody and injury, 8 civilian witnesses in the main bay who needed medical assessment, a security guard with a head injury, and a staff population that ranged from hiding in locked rooms to standing in corridors demanding answers. That was something else entirely. She moved through it the way she moved through things that were too large to be managed all at once, by breaking it into the next decision and then the next one after that. Marcus Trent got a proper assessment and imaging and was confirmed for a grade 2 concussion and a laceration that needed 6 stitches. She sat with him for the 4 minutes it took to clean and close the cut, because he was 23 and had been on the floor for over an hour and was trying hard not to show that his hands were shaking. "You hit the button," he said, halfway through. "The blue button. That was you." "Yes. I was going for it when they—" "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Is everybody okay?" "One serious injury, the others are going to be fine." He nodded, then winced at the movement. "The dog," he said. "I saw him earlier, in the corridor. I thought that was a concussion thing. He's real." "He's yours?" "Yes." Another pause. "He's big." "He is." She tied off the last suture and cut the thread, and Marcus looked down at his hands for a moment. I didn't know what to do, he said. When they came in, I didn't know. You knew about the blue button, she said. You had the right information. The situation moved faster than the information. She pulled off her gloves. That's not the same as not knowing what to do. He looked at her. She could see him deciding whether to accept that or argue with it, and then deciding to accept it, which was the more useful choice and also the harder one. She left him with the attending and went to find Dara. Dara Winslow was in the administrative corridor with 2 agents and a phone pressed to her ear, and she held up one finger when she saw Maya, which meant, wait, and also, this is the call that matters. Maya waited. She leaned against the wall and let herself notice, briefly, that her elbow was swollen and her left knee, which she'd landed on during the situation in the server room, was doing something it hadn't been doing an hour ago. She would deal with both of those facts when the night was over. Atlas sat beside her and put his chin on her knee, which was the knee that wasn't already complaining, and she put her hand on his head. Dara ended the call and turned. Imaging archive extraction, she said without preamble. Partial. They got approximately 40% of the archive before your people hit the blue button and the system flagged the extraction. The authentication server data, 0%. Your team in the server room stopped it at 11. She paused. The annex relay got 63% of the legacy records before it was interrupted. Maya worked through the math. The archive partial. Is it enough to cross-reference? Our analysts say no, not without the authentication bridge. And without the authentication data, the imaging records can't be linked back to the protected identities. Dara's voice was neutral in the specific way that meant she was working at being neutral. The short version is, the operation failed. They didn't get what they came for. Because the server room was stopped first. Because the server room was stopped first, Dara confirmed. Maya nodded. Dara looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read because Dara generally didn't let things onto her face that she hadn't decided to put there. How did you know, she asked, about the server room being the critical piece? I didn't. I went there because Atlas flagged the corridor, she paused. And because the wireless relay in the annex and the direct cable access in the server room were redundant for the same target, so they weren't the same target. Dara was quiet. You've been watching this hospital, Maya said. It wasn't a question, a beat. We've been aware of a threat vector involving regional health system security infrastructure for several weeks. And you didn't flag it to the facility. The threat assessment indicated a low probability of Winslow. Maya looked at her. There were 3 protected witnesses in this building. Dara's jaw tightened, barely. The assessment was wrong, she said. It was more than Maya had expected her to admit, and both of them knew it. What happens now? Maya asked. Standard post-incident protocol. The facility goes under federal review. The suspects will be transferred to federal custody. She glanced at the corridor toward the administrative wing. And you're going to need to give a statement, probably more than one. I know. The statement is going to raise questions about your background. I know that too. Dara looked at her with something that might, in a different light, have been close to respect. You should have told them, Dara said. When you took this job, your record, even the redacted version, would have made me a liability to the people who were supposed to be protected, Maya said. Anyone looking for connections between former SOC personnel and regional health facilities would have had a flag. Dara thought about that for a moment. That's actually sound reasoning? Yes. A long pause. It also meant you spent 14 months letting people treat you like you didn't know anything. People treat you however they decide to treat you regardless, Maya said. I've been in rooms where everyone in the room knew exactly what I'd done and where I'd done it, and they still treated me like I was the least important person there. Credentials don't fix that. Dara didn't have an answer for that, which was the correct response. It was after 2 in the morning when Dr. Hargrove arrived at the hospital. He wasn't on call. He'd been reached by the hospital's emergency notification chain, which had been activated by Patricia Vole approximately 40 minutes after the incident began, and which had resulted, over the following hour, in a cascade of people arriving at Ironwood Valley in various states of professional alarm. The board chairman, the head of hospital security, 2 attorneys from the hospital's legal counsel firm. All of them arrived the way institutions arrived at their own crises, loudly, full of the appearance of urgency, and primarily concerned with positioning. Hargrove came through the main entrance and immediately found his way to the administrative corridor, where the density of federal agents made it look like the wrong kind of convention. He spotted Maya at the nursing station, where she was completing the incident documentation she had been methodically building for the last 30 minutes, and his expression went through a rapid sequence of adjustments. She watched him approach without stopping typing. "Nurse Caldwell." His voice was the voice he used when he wanted to sound in command of a situation that he was observing from the outside. "Can someone tell me what exactly happened here tonight?" "The incident documentation will be available through the federal case file once the review is complete," she said. "For now, I'd direct your questions to Special Agent Winslow." She tilted her head toward Dara, who was 15 feet away and had already clocked Hargrove's arrival. "I'm asking you," he said. "I know." She kept typing. He was quiet for a moment in the way people got quiet when they were deciding whether to escalate or absorb. "I heard you were involved," he said. In the response, "I was present." "Maya." He had never called her Maya before. He had called her Nurse Caldwell for 14 months, in the same tone that people used when they wanted the title to function as a diminutive. "What I said yesterday in front of the staff, the performance review is still pending," she said. "I'd rather not discuss it until the federal review of tonight's incident is complete, since the two situations are going to intersect in ways that will need to be addressed in writing." He blinked. She could see the moment when he understood that the ground had shifted beneath him and that he was going to need better footing before he knew where to stand. "Of course," he said after a moment. "Of course." He moved away. She watched him go and felt nothing in particular about it, which was different from how she'd felt walking out of Patricia Voll's office the previous morning, and she noticed the difference without congratulating herself for it. What she felt instead was tired. Specifically, thoroughly, bone-level tired, the kind that came not from the physical work of the night, but from the accumulated weight of a year of performing competence for people who had already decided how much of it they were willing to see. Her elbow throbbed. Her knee was worse than it had been 20 minutes ago. She was going to need imaging on both of them sometime in the next 12 hours, which was an absurd situation to be in while sitting in a hospital. Atlas was under the desk at her feet, asleep. She looked at the incident documentation on the screen and added one more observation: the timestamp on the security alert for the imaging archive, cross-referenced against the arrival time of the federal team. And then she saved the file and leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere in the administrative wing, she could hear Dara's voice, and beneath it the lower, steadier voices of people who were beginning, carefully, to pull this night apart and figure out exactly what it contained. The federal debrief began at 3:15 a.m. in the hospital boardroom, which had been commandeered by Dara's team with an efficiency that clearly unsettled the board chairman, a man named Elliot Farrow, who had arrived at 11:50 in a suit that looked like he'd put it on over pajamas and had not yet found a way to be useful. There were 6 people in the room: Maya, Dara, 2 federal agents, the hospital's legal counsel, and, to Maya's mild surprise, Dr. Solis, who had apparently been in the hospital when the incident began and had stayed, which she found she respected despite herself. The session was structured as a witness statement, but functioned as something more detailed. Dara asked questions in the careful, sequential way of someone who had done this many times and had learned to go slowly enough that the picture that emerged was complete rather than fast. Maya answered in the same register, omitting nothing, adding nothing that wasn't in direct response to what was asked. It took 40 minutes to get to the part where Dara said, flatly and with no particular inflection, "Agent Caldwell." The room shifted. Maya said, "Former. I've been inactive for 2 years." Legal counsel looked up from his notepad. Elliot Farrow stopped adjusting his cuffs. Dr. Solis, to his credit, didn't change his expression at all. "Your background," Dara said, for the room, "includes 11 years of active service, including assignment as a Special Operations Combat Medic with an interagency task force focused on tactical medical response in high-threat environments. Your record is partially classified. The portions available indicate multiple commendations, including one for actions during an extraction operation in," she glanced at her file, "a location I'll leave out of the record." "That's accurate," Maya said. Elliot Farrow said slowly, "You're telling me our floor nurse is—" A former federal operator with combat trauma specialization, yes, Dara said, without looking at him. Which is relevant to understanding why the threat tonight was identified and partially neutralized by a single staff member before federal response arrived. Legal counsel was writing very fast. The actions taken tonight, Dara continued, still addressing the room but clearly directing her words toward the people in it who needed them most, prevented the completion of a coordinated data extraction targeting protected federal witnesses. The incomplete extraction is not a full success for us. 40% of the imaging archive was obtained, and our analysts are working to determine the exposure risk. But the critical failure point of the operation, the authentication bridge, was stopped at 11%. That stop was made by Maya Caldwell, alone, before federal response arrived. She paused. She also identified the fourth target location, redirected civilian staff to safety, provided first response to an injured security officer, provided medical response to an injured suspect, and maintained situational awareness across 3 simultaneous incident locations. Another pause. While working an overnight nursing shift following a formal performance review meeting earlier that day in which her professional judgment was officially called into question. The room was quiet. Dr. Solis put down his pen. Elliot Farrow opened his mouth, closed it, and appeared to do a calculation that was not going well for any of the answers he was arriving at. Maya said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the moments where someone else says the thing you've needed said are the moments where silence is the most powerful available response. There will be a full federal review of the hospital's security posture and incident response protocols, Dara said, closing the folder on the table in front of her. That review will include an assessment of the internal reporting environment that resulted in the hospital's most qualified emergency response asset being placed under administrative review for the practice of clinical judgment. She looked at Elliot Farrow directly. I'd recommend you have your counsel review the documentation from that performance review before we continue. Farrow looked at legal counsel. Legal counsel looked at his notepad in a way that suggested he was wishing it were a window. It was past 4 a.m. when the formal session ended. The informal conversations that followed it lasted another hour. The kind of conversations that happened in corridors and doorways after official things concluded, where the actual positions and decisions began to surface. Maya stepped out of the boardroom and walked to the end of the administrative corridor and stood in front of the window that looked out over the hospital's loading area. The service vehicles were parked in their overnight positions. A security light made a yellow circle on the wet asphalt. Nothing was moving. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn until Dr. Solis said her name. Caldwell. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the corridor, hands in his coat pockets, with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing something and still wasn't sure it was the right thing to say. The patient, he said. Priya Anand. From last night. He paused. She's doing okay. I checked this morning before my shift. The treatment got complicated by the delay, but she responded well. I know, Maya said. I checked too. He nodded. I should have backed you. She looked at him. When Hargrove overrode the consult, I knew the clinical picture was wrong. He stopped. I should have backed you. Yes, she said. You should have. He absorbed that. I'm sorry. She considered it, not whether to accept it, but what it actually meant in a way that was useful rather than just comfortable. Solis was not Hargrove. He'd made a bad call under institutional pressure, which was a different category of failure than someone who wielded institutional pressure as a weapon. Be better next time, she said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical. He seemed to understand the difference, because he nodded once and didn't push for more. She turned back to the window. After a moment, she heard his footsteps retreating down the corridor, and then there was just the loading area and the yellow light and the sound of the building resettling around her. Atlas appeared at her left side. She hadn't heard him coming, which she never did anymore, and leaned against her leg. I know, she said quietly. She was going to need to give at least 2 more formal statements. She was going to need imaging on her elbow and her knee. She was going to need to decide at some point soon whether she wanted to stay in a building where the last 14 months had happened. She was going to need to figure out what the federal review was going to mean for her in ways that Dara hadn't fully spelled out yet, and that Maya had a feeling were going to be complicated. But those were the next problems. Not this moment. This moment was the window and the quiet and the weight of Atlas against her leg, which was exactly 9 years old and had been through considerably worse than tonight and was still here. She was still here. The sound came without warning, a low, sharp buzz from the hospital's PA system, the kind that preceded an emergency announcement, and then a voice she didn't recognize saying something about a code situation on the third floor that resolved within 4 seconds into routine medical language. Not another incident, just the building doing what buildings did. But in the 3 seconds between the buzz and the resolution, she had already shifted her weight forward onto her good leg, and her hand had already moved to Atlas's lead. Old reflex, still there. She let out a slow breath and dropped her hand. And then her phone rang. Not the contact number she'd been using to communicate with Dara, not the hospital's internal system, but her personal line, with a number she didn't recognize but that had a prefix she did. A federal prefix. She looked at it for 1 second, then answered. The voice on the other end was a man she had never spoken to, but whose name she recognized immediately, and what he said in the first 12 words of the call changed the shape of the next hour in ways she was not prepared for. The man's name was Deputy Director Raymond Tusk, and the first 12 words he said were, "I know who you are, and I need you to stay in that building." She almost said something sharp back. Almost. "I'm not going anywhere," she said instead. "I have statements to complete." "Good. Don't complete them yet." His voice was the kind of voice that had been giving directives for so long that it had stopped sounding like requests even when it was trying to. "I'm going to be at Ironwood Valley in 90 minutes. There are things about tonight that your contact doesn't have full visibility on, and I need you present when we go through them." "What things?" "Not on this line." She looked at the window, at the yellow circle on the wet asphalt, at absolutely nothing helpful. 90 minutes, she said. 90 minutes. He hung up. She held the phone for a second, then pocketed it, then looked at Atlas. "Don't give me that," she told him. He wasn't giving her anything. He was just looking at her with the steady, patient attention of an animal who had long ago decided she was worth following and hadn't found a reason to revise that assessment. She went to find a chair that wasn't in a boardroom and sat in it and did not sleep, but let her body be horizontal for 40 minutes, while her mind worked through what she knew and what she didn't, and what the distance between those two things was likely to contain. Dara found her at 5:10 a.m., which was 20 minutes before Tusk was due to arrive, and her expression when she walked into the break room and saw Maya in the chair told Maya that Dara had just been told something she hadn't known an hour ago. "You know him," Maya said. "He's my director's director." Dara sat down across from her. "He doesn't come to field sites." "He's coming to this one." Dara pressed her fingers to her temple for a moment. "What did he say to you?" "That there are things about tonight you don't have full visibility on." The expression on Dara's face was the expression of a person doing rapid career math in their head and not particularly enjoying the results. "That's... okay." She dropped her hand. "Okay. Did he give you anything else?" "No." "How do you know him?" "I don't. He knows me, apparently." Maya paused. "Or he knows who I was." Dara looked at her for a long moment. "Is there something in your record I don't have access to?" "Probably several things." "That's not helpful, I know." Maya looked at the ceiling. "I ran 3 operations with interagency oversight. 2 of them involved protective custody of federal assets in clinical settings. If Tusk is connected to the program that covers protected witnesses, then the overlap with tonight isn't a coincidence. You think he's been tracking the threat to this hospital? I think he's been tracking something connected to it, and tonight moved it from a threat assessment file to something with names and evidence attached." She paused. "I think the 4 men in this building tonight are the small end of something larger, and Tusk wants to make sure the larger thing doesn't lose its shape when the small end gets prosecuted." Dara was quiet, in that working way she had. "The partial extraction," Maya said, "the imaging archive. You said your analysts were assessing the exposure risk." "Yes." "What's the exposure risk to the operation? Not the witnesses, the operation itself. If the people who sent those 4 men tonight can cross-reference the archive data against other sources they may already have." Dara's expression changed in a way that was small but specific. "That's what Tusk is coming about," Maya said. It wasn't a question, and Dara didn't treat it like one. She looked at the table. "There may be a 5th element," Dara said quietly. "Something that ran parallel to tonight's extraction that we haven't fully mapped yet." Maya felt the particular sensation of a picture that had seemed complete developing an additional corner. How parallel, she said. We don't know yet. Dara looked up. That's the honest answer. Maya sat with that for a moment, then stood up, because sitting down while trying to think about something that required movement had never worked for her. Wake me up when Tusk gets here, she said. You're not going to sleep. No, she agreed, but I need to walk. She walked the east corridor twice, then the administrative wing once, then stood in the server room for 4 minutes looking at the laptop that was still on the evidence table exactly where it had been left, surrounded by numbered markers from the federal forensics team that had processed the room while Maya was in the boardroom. The transfer status bar was frozen at 11%. Someone had taken a photograph of the screen. The photograph was in the case file. 11%. She had stopped it because Atlas had flagged the corridor, because the relay device and the cable access were redundant, because a facilities technician had complained in a break room 2 weeks ago about a legacy system that hadn't been migrated yet, and she had filed that complaint away in the part of her brain that collected details without being asked to. She had stopped it because she had been standing in that specific hospital for 14 months, knowing the layout, knowing the systems, knowing the gaps, not because anyone had asked her to know those things, but because knowing them was what she did, had always done, in every space she'd ever occupied. She had stopped it because she had been treated like a floor nurse for 14 months and had done the job of a floor nurse, and beneath that had continued being every other thing she'd ever been, quietly, without announcement, because there was no version of her that knew how to stop. She thought about Gerald Okafor and his grade 3 splenic laceration, about Priya Anand and the meningitis that had almost been missed, about the 2 clinical flags she'd raised in the months before those, the ones Patricia Vole had listed in her folder like evidence of malfunction, about Marcus and the blue button and the way his hands had shaken, about the folder that had been full of the right decisions, framed as the wrong behavior. She left the server room and went back to the break room and was there when Tusk arrived at 5:47 a.m. Raymond Tusk was 63, lean in the way of someone who had never found food interesting, with the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from long practice at managing what he showed. He was accompanied by 2 people whose function Maya read immediately. One was taking notes, one was watching the room. He shook Maya's hand when Dara introduced them, which surprised her, because shaking hands wasn't something she associated with the category of person he appeared to be. You stopped the authentication bridge, he said. Yes. Walk me through how you identified it as the primary target. She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which was also not what she'd expected. The note-taker wrote. The room watcher watched the room. When she finished, Tusk was quiet for a moment. The relay device in the annex, he said. Did you examine it closely? I identified it as a wireless extraction relay. I didn't touch it. Did you see the manufacturer marking on the casing? She thought back. 4 seconds in a low-lit corridor, the device face up on the floor where it had fallen. She had the image. She had most images, once she'd seen them. She turned it over in her memory. No manufacturer marking, she said. The casing was clean. That's because it was custom built, Tusk said. And we've seen that specific build before, twice in the last 18 months. Once in a federal records facility in Oregon, once in a regional law enforcement data center in Nevada. Both extractions were successful. He paused. Tonight's was not, because of what happened in the server room. Maya waited. The organization behind this, we've been calling them the Hollow Network internally, which is a working name, not a public designation, has been building towards something specific, a composite profile. Protected identities, institutional security architecture, federal authentication data. He looked at her steadily. They're not selling the data, they're using it for something operational. What operation? We don't fully know yet, but we know the Ironwood Valley extraction was one node in a larger collection effort. 3 other facilities were targeted in the same 72-hour window, 2 in other states, 1 in Canada. How did the others go? The other 2 domestic facilities, complete extractions. The Canadian facility, partial. He paused. Of the 4 targets, Ironwood Valley is the only one where the authentication data was successfully protected. The room was very quiet. Which means, Maya said slowly, that the composite profile they're building has 3 of its 4 pieces. Yes. and if the partial from the imaging archive can be cross-referenced against data from the other 3 facilities. We're working to determine that. Our forensic analysts have been running that scenario since we confirmed the other extractions at approximately 3 a.m. He looked at her. The reason I'm here, and the reason I needed you to stay, is that the 5th element I believe Agent Winslow mentioned. He paused, and Maya realized he'd already spoken to Dara about what Dara knew. Is not a digital element. We believe there's a human source inside a regional healthcare system, someone who provided the network with information about this facility's security architecture before the extraction team came in tonight. Specifically, someone who knew about the keypad access point to the administrative server room, the layout of the communications hub, and the location of the legacy records annex relative to the hospital's main network infrastructure. Maya sat very still. That level of detail, Tusk continued, doesn't come from open source information about this facility. It requires access, insider access. You have someone in this building, she said. We believe so, yes. She looked at Dara, who was looking at the table. Who knew about the keypad access point? Maya asked. Not to either of them, to herself. Running the list. The administrative server room's keypad lock had been a detail she'd noticed on the orientation tour. The orientation tour was for new staff. Everyone who had come to Ironwood Valley in the past 2 years would have seen that corridor. But the internal layout of the communications hub, the secondary access point, the fact that the hub connected to the server room, that wasn't tour information. That was operational knowledge of a building's infrastructure. The kind of knowledge that came from working in the facility or from having access to its technical specifications. Facilities management, she said. Tusk nodded slowly. Or someone with access to the building's architectural documentation. She paused. Which would include the executive administrative team and anyone who'd been involved in recent infrastructure projects. She paused again. The server migration, the record system conversion, both of those happened in the last 18 months. Tusk looked at the note-taker who was writing. The consulting firm that managed the record system conversion, Maya said. Do you have their contract documentation? We requested it at 4 a.m. We expect to have it within the hour. She nodded. She was thinking about the conversation she'd overheard in the break room 2 weeks ago. The facilities technician, the legacy system, the complaint about the records migration being stalled. She was thinking about who else had been in the break room at that time. She was also thinking about the performance review, the folder, the neat documentation of every time she had flagged something that later proved to be correct, framed as a pattern of behavioral problems. Someone had wanted her out of this building, not because she was a bad nurse, not because she was difficult, because she was the person most likely to notice things that were supposed to go unnoticed. She looked at Tusk. The performance review that was initiated against me, she said carefully. When was the formal complaint filed with administration? Tusk glanced at the note-taker. 6 weeks ago, the note-taker said, consulting her file. Maya sat with that number. 6 weeks ago. Approximately 3 weeks after the record system conversion project concluded. Approximately the same time that she now understood, the Hollow Network had begun finalizing the operational plan for the extraction at Ironwood Valley. Someone filed a complaint to move me out of the emergency department, she said, before the operation, to reduce the probability that the right person would be in the right place when it happened. The room was very, very quiet. That's our working hypothesis, Tusk said. Dara finally looked up from the table. Her expression was the expression of someone who had been sitting with information that was uncomfortable to sit with and had just watched someone else arrive at it independently. Who filed the complaint? Maya asked. The answer came at 7:19 a.m., when the contract documentation from the record system conversion arrived via secure transfer, and Tusk's team began running the names. The consulting firm was called Meridian Data Solutions, incorporated 18 months ago, with a contract history that included the 3 other facilities targeted in the 72-hour window. The firm had 2 named principals. One of them was a shell identity, a convincing one, but a shell. The other was real. The other was a name that had been sitting in Maya's peripheral vision for 14 months. Not Hargrove, not Patricia Vole. The hospital's director of information systems, a man named Curtis Aldrin, who had been at Ironwood Valley for 3 years, who had overseen the records conversion project, who had been present at the administrative meeting where Maya's performance review had been formally discussed, and who had, 2 weeks ago, filed a supplemental complaint with the nursing administration characterizing Maya's behavior during the Gerald Okafor incident as inappropriate escalation of patient advocacy beyond the scope of nursing role. She had not known about the supplemental complaint. It had not been mentioned in Patricia Voll's office. It had been filed quietly, and it had been designed to add weight to a record that was already building a case for her removal. When Tusk's agent walked into the boardroom at 7:23 and said Aldrin's name, Maya felt something move through her that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean, too complete for what it actually felt like. What it felt like was the specific, exhausted recognition of a thing that had always been true becoming something that everyone in the room now had to deal with. Dara was already on her phone. "Where is he now?" Maya asked. "He came in at 6:30, the agent said. "Standard arrival time. He's in his office." "Does he know we have the contract documentation?" "Not yet." She looked at Tusk. "I'd like to be present," she said. "When you go to him." Tusk considered it. "You understand you're a witness in this case. Your presence could—" "I understand the evidentiary complications. I'm asking anyway." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "You can be in the corridor." In fact, Curtis Aldrin's office was on the second floor of the administrative wing, 3 doors down from Patricia Voll's lavender plug-in office, and it had a glass panel in the wall beside the door that allowed a person standing in the corridor to see the occupant clearly without entering the room. Maya stood at that panel. She had seen Aldrin dozens of times over 14 months. He was the kind of person who existed in the margins of institutional life, present at meetings, involved in projects, always attached to something administrative enough to be present without being accountable to anyone below the executive level. Medium height, mid-40s, the generic professional effect of someone who had spent years learning to be unmemorable. She watched Tusk go in with 2 agents and close the door. She could not hear the conversation. She could see it. Aldrin stood up when they came in, which was reflex. He sat back down when Tusk said something and placed a document on his desk. He looked at the document. Then he looked up at the glass panel, and for one moment, one specific, unguarded, completely human moment, he looked directly at Maya. She didn't move, didn't look away. What crossed his face in that moment was not guilt exactly. Guilt was an internal state, and what she was seeing was something more external, the expression of a person recalculating the distance between where they thought they were and where they actually were, and finding the gap unbridgeable. He looked back at Tusk and said something. Tusk replied. The note-taker was writing. Maya turned away from the glass panel and walked back down the corridor. Boom. By 9 a.m., the hospital had shifted from crisis mode into the specific institutional anxiety that follows a crisis, the kind that expressed itself as meetings, memos, urgent conversations in corners, and a pervasive low-level alarm among people who were trying to figure out how much of what had happened they were going to be held responsible for. Patricia Voll found Maya at the nursing station at 9:12. She looked like she'd had approximately the same amount of sleep as Maya, which was to say very little, and she was holding a folder, a different folder from the one she'd been holding 2 mornings ago. But Maya noticed with a particular dry clarity that Patricia Voll's instinct under pressure was always to hold a folder. "Maya," she said, could we speak privately? I've been instructed by the Federal Review Team to document all conversations with hospital administration until the review is complete, Maya said. I can speak with you here or with a federal agent present. Your choice. Patricia's expression went through something complicated. Here is fine, she said after a pause. Okay. The performance review. Patricia put the folder on the desk. It was closed. I've been informed this morning that the complaint filed by Mr. Aldrin, the supplemental documentation, was generated as part of an intentional effort to... She stopped. Started again. The Federal Review Team has indicated that the complaint was not filed in good faith. I know, Maya said. I want you to know that if I had been aware... Patricia. Maya kept her voice even. What do you want to happen right now? The question visibly caught her off guard, which was why Maya had asked it. Not to be cruel, but because the circuitous approach was going to take 40 minutes to arrive at what could be said in 2. I want to formally suspend the performance review, Patricia said. And I want you to know that the hospital considers your actions last night to be extraordinary, and that we intend to make that position clear in the documentation. Good, Maya said. Make sure the formal suspension is in writing, with a timestamp that predates any external communications about the review. And make sure the supplemental complaint from Aldrin is flagged as part of the federal case file, not just quietly removed from my record. Patricia blinked. Yes, of course. And the nursing administration email chain from 6 weeks ago, the one where the review was discussed before it was formally filed. I'd like that preserved in full. Patricia held the folder a little tighter. Yes, we can do that. Good. Maya looked at her. Is there anything else? There wasn't. Patricia Vole walked back down the corridor with her folder, and Maya watched her go and felt nothing vengeful about it, just the specific clarity of having been precise when precision was required. Hargrove appeared at the nursing station at 9:40. He was alone, which was different from how he usually operated, and he was not wearing the authority like a jacket the way he usually wore it. He looked like someone who had been up all night, which he probably had, and he looked like someone who was in the process of revising a number of assumptions about the world, which he definitely was. He stood at the edge of the nursing station without speaking for a moment. The Anand case, he said finally. The neurology consult. Yes. Your flag was correct. I know. And last night. He paused. What you did. Yes. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. She let it stretch. She wasn't going to fill the space for him. I owe you an apology, he said, a real one, not, he gestured vaguely, not a diplomatic one. She looked at him. He was not comfortable. He was not performing discomfort either. It was real, which was the thing she'd been unsure about until this moment. The discomfort of a man who had genuinely believed, until approximately 12 hours ago, that his judgment was reliable, and was now standing in the ruins of that belief trying to figure out what to build instead. She was not interested in destroying him further. She was also not interested in making it easy. Then give me a real one, she said. He took a breath. I was wrong about you, consistently. I used institutional authority to override clinical judgment that was better than mine, and I framed it as a professional standard issue when it was a personal one. He held her gaze. I humiliated you in front of your colleagues, and I filed documentation that I believed was correct and was not. And I'm sorry. It was a good apology. It had the shape of something that cost something. I hear you, she said. He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He nodded once and walked away, and she turned back to the nursing station. At 10:55 a.m., Tusk came to find her. Aldrin had been taken into federal custody at 10:30. The arrest had happened quietly. No spectacle, no corridor drama. But in a hospital, nothing happened without being seen. And by 11 a.m., every floor in Ironwood Valley knew that the Director of Information Systems had been escorted out by federal agents. Maya was at the nursing station when Tusk appeared, which was becoming a reliable location for consequential conversations, and he stood across the counter from her the way people stood in hospitals when they were trying to have a serious conversation in a space that wasn't designed for it. Aldrin is cooperating, he said. Partially. Enough for us to start filling in the larger picture. He paused. The Hollow network is larger than we initially assessed. The 4 facilities in the 72-hour window were not a one-time operation. They're part of a sustained intelligence-gathering effort targeting federal protective programs. How long has it been running? At least 2 years, possibly 3. He looked at her directly. The Oregon and Nevada extractions that I mentioned, those gave them enough to identify that Ironwood Valley was a protected facility. Aldrin confirmed that he was approached 14 months ago. She felt the number settle. 14 months ago was when she had been hired. They knew I was here, she said. We believe the hiring of a former SOC operator to a staff nursing position at a protected facility created a flag in their intelligence picture. They didn't know your specific background. Your record is well classified. But they knew someone with operational history had been placed here, and they wanted to reduce the risk. He paused. The performance review was Aldrin's solution. Remove you from the emergency department, reduce your proximity to the facility's most sensitive areas, create a documented behavioral history that would make any future report from you about internal security concerns easy to dismiss. She stared at the nursing station counter. 14 months. She had spent 14 months being treated like a problem, being managed, being maneuvered toward the margins of a hospital that she had come to because she needed solid ground under her feet. And the entire time, the reason she was being pushed was because someone with an intelligence file and a long-term operational plan had looked at her and correctly assessed that she was the largest obstacle to what they intended to do. They had been afraid of her. They just hadn't let her know. The irony, she said, is that if they'd left me alone, I would probably have been in a different corridor last night. Tusk looked at her. Yes, he said. That's occurred to us as well. She let out a slow breath. What happens now? The federal review of the facility continues. Aldrin's case goes to prosecution. The Hollow Network investigation expands based on what we've recovered. He paused. And there will be a conversation, a formal one, at a level above mine, about your status. My nursing status? Among other things. He held her gaze. There are people who would like to talk to you about your future professional direction. She understood what he meant. She also understood that it was not a conversation for right now, at a nursing station, at 11 a.m., after a night that had started with a performance review and ended with a federal arrest. Tell them to get in line, she said. He almost smiled. It was a very small, almost. I'll communicate that diplomatically, he said. He moved to leave, then stopped. One more thing, he said. The man in the server room, the one with the shoulder injury and the head trauma. He paused. He's stable. His name is Marco Fierro, and he has a prior record in 3 jurisdictions. He's also, it turns out, one of the more junior members of the network. Recruited approximately 8 months ago. Paid well. Not told very much. Another pause. He gave us our first confirmed name above Aldrin's level. Good, she said. He also told the agents processing him that when you confronted him in the server room, he initially assumed you weren't a threat. Tusk looked at her steadily. He said he reconsidered that assessment very quickly. She looked back at him. Good. This time he did leave, and she turned back to the nursing station and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the counter. The case file was building. The arrests were beginning. The investigation was widening in a direction that was going to take months, possibly years, to fully resolve. The man who had spent 6 weeks engineering her professional removal was in federal custody. The 3 protected witnesses were safe in a location that was not this hospital. Priya Anand was recovering. Marcus Trent's concussion was being properly managed. The suspect with the epidural hematoma had been taken into surgical care and was, as of the last update, out of immediate danger. The immediate things were mostly okay. She rolled her shoulders, felt the pull of the bruised elbow, and looked at the nursing station board. The intake list, the room assignments, the pending documentation. The hospital was still a hospital. The work was still the work. She had been about to reach for the first chart when her phone buzzed. This time the hospital's internal system, a message from the records department flagging something in the system audit that had been triggered by the Federal Forensics Review. She opened it, read it again. The audit had flagged an anomaly in the clinical records system. Not the legacy system, not the administrative server, but the primary clinical database that contained active patient files, medication records, treatment histories. The anomaly was a series of access log entries from 4 months ago. Entries that showed a specific set of patient records being accessed by a user ID that belonged to a staff member who had been on leave during the exact dates in question. A staff member who, according to the audit, had never been notified of the anomaly because the original system flag had been cleared, manually cleared, from a terminal in the Director of Information Systems office. She read the dates again. 4 months ago. 3 months before the extraction attempt. The records that had been accessed were not random. They were the files of 3 patients who had been admitted to Ironwood Valley in the previous year under circumstances that had later appeared in the federal protected witness documentation Tusk had referenced. Aldrin hadn't just provided building schematics. He had been feeding patient identification intelligence for at least 4 months before the operation. And the staff member whose user ID had been used to access those records, whose credentials had been borrowed or stolen or voluntarily provided, was someone who was still in this building. She looked at the user ID in the audit log. Then she looked up at the nursing station and found, without particularly trying, the person that user ID belonged to. Deborah Rice was standing at the scheduling board 30 feet away, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, making a note on the shift roster with a red pen. completely ordinary in every visible way. And she had not, Maya now realized, been anywhere near the main bay last night when the incident began, had not responded to the building alert, had told the shift supervisor, according to the log that Maya had helped compile at 2 a.m., that she had been in the staff restroom on the second floor for 40 minutes. Maya did not reach for her phone immediately. She looked at the user ID in the audit one more time, making absolutely sure of what she was reading. Then she looked at Deborah Rice, who was still writing on the scheduling board, still completely ordinary, still entirely unaware that the audit log had just placed her at the center of something that was about to become very complicated. Then Maya reached for her phone and typed a message to Dara Winslow because she had learned, over 11 years and 14 months and one very long night, that the correct response to discovering a threat was not to act on it alone when you didn't have to. She sent the message, then set the phone face down on the counter and picked up the first patient chart and kept working because the work was still the work. And Deborah Rice was still 30 feet away, and the next 60 seconds were going to require Maya to look like someone who hadn't just found the last piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself for 14 months. She kept her eyes on the chart for 43 seconds. She knew it was 43 seconds because she counted them, not in the anxious way of someone trying to manage panic, but in the deliberate way of someone who had learned that the space between discovering a threat and responding to it was where most mistakes got made. 43 seconds was enough time for her phone to buzz with Dara's response. On my way, 2 minutes, do not move her. And enough time to get her breathing level and her face neutral and her hands steady on the patient chart. Deborah Rice was still at the scheduling board, still writing. The red pen moved across the roster in small, economical strokes. Maya turned to the next page of the chart. The thing she was trying not to think about, the thing that kept pushing at the edge of the 43 seconds, was that she had known Deborah for 14 months. Not known her the way you knew a friend, but known her the way you knew anyone you spent 40-plus hours a week in close proximity to. The particular way she held her glasses. The fact that she kept a specific brand of throat lozenge in her left scrub pocket. The way she had, twice in 14 months, covered for junior nurses who were having bad shifts without making them feel managed. Small things, true things, none of which changed what the audit log said. None of which changed the dates, the user ID, the 3 patient records, the manually cleared system flag from Aldrin's terminal. But they sat alongside the truth in a way that made the truth heavier, and she let herself feel the weight of that for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was the remainder of the 43 seconds. Then Dara came through the secondary hall door with 2 agents at a pace that was fast without being a run, and Maya set down the chart. Almost said sati. She did not watch the arrest. She heard it, the change in ambient sound that moved through the nursing station area like a pressure shift, voices dropping and then cutting out entirely. The brief exchange in Deborah's register that started confused and became something else, something that Maya recognized as the sound of a person's constructed version of their life hitting the truth of it at speed. She went to the supply room and stood there for 2 minutes with her back against the shelving, an atlas at her feet, and she breathed. She had been right about all of it. Every clinical flag, every instinct about the building's shape, every piece of evidence she had assembled in the dark, under pressure, without the institutional support that was supposed to exist for exactly that kind of situation. She had been right, and the rightness of it did not feel like winning. It felt like the end of something that had cost too much. She came out of the supply room when she heard the sound of people moving toward the exit, federal personnel, not panicked staff. And she passed the nursing station where Deborah had been standing without looking at the scheduling board. She did not want to see the roster with its last half-finished notation in red pen. Some things you looked at, and some things you looked at once and put away. Whoa. The formal interview with Dara about Deborah Rice happened at 1 p.m. in the same boardroom that had hosted the federal debrief that morning, and by then the picture had sharpened considerably. Deborah had not been a knowing recruit the way Aldrin was. She had not been approached by the Hollow Network with an offer and a choice. What had happened was quieter and more ordinary, and in some ways more depressing. She had been carrying debt, significant debt, the specific kind that accumulates over years of wages that never quite caught up with the cost of the life they were supposed to support. She had been identified through a financial profile, approached by Aldrin through a gradual, careful, years-long process that had never announced itself as what it was until she was already inside it. She had provided her login credentials for what she had been told was a records audit. She had been told the access was routine. She had been told, when she asked questions that were too close to the right questions, that she was overthinking a paperwork issue. By the time she understood what she had provided and why, the information was already in the Hollow Network's hands, and Aldrin had made clear, without saying it directly, that the path she'd walked to get there was not one she could disclose without consequences for herself. She wasn't a volunteer, Maya said when Dara had finished laying it out. No, Dara said. She was a victim who got used. The cooperation at the end, providing credentials, staying on the floor during the incident, that crosses lines we can't overlook, but the prosecution will factor in the coercion. Will it factor in enough? Dara looked at her. That's not something I can answer. It was the honest response. Maya sat with it. She hated me, Maya said after a moment. Not bitterly, just as an observation, feeling it out. These last 14 months she made things harder for me. The complaint she filed, the way she backed the performance review. She was protecting herself, Dara said. You were the variable in the facility she couldn't predict or control. If you got removed from the ER, you became less of a risk to the operation. She didn't know about the operation. She knew something was wrong. That's usually enough to make people act in ways that are hard to explain cleanly. Maya stared at the table. This was the part that didn't resolve neatly. The part where the person who had made her professional life harder for 14 months turned out to be not a villain in the simple sense, not someone who had looked at Maya and chosen cruelty, but someone who had been frightened and cornered and had made a series of choices under pressure that had compounded in the direction of harm. It was harder to be angry about, which did not make it easier to forgive, and she wasn't going to pretend it did. Is there anything else I need to provide today? She asked. Not today. Dara closed her folder. You're done for today, Maya. She almost said something about that being the first time anyone had said that to her in a very long time. She didn't. She just stood up. The next 72 hours moved the way the aftermath of large events moved, in the specific rhythm of institutions trying to reorient themselves after something had exposed the gap between what they claimed to be and what they actually were. The hospital board convened an emergency session on Friday morning. The Federal Review Team's preliminary findings were delivered to the board chairman, Elliot Farrow, in a document that Maya was not present for, but that Tusk later summarized for her in a single sentence. The document established that Ironwood Valley Medical Center's internal security posture, administrative oversight protocols, and staff safety reporting environment had all contributed to conditions that allowed the breach to develop undetected. In plain language, the building had failed the people inside it, and the people who ran the building had built the conditions for that failure over time, in small decisions and institutional habits, and the particular corporate reflex of smoothing over friction rather than understanding what was causing it. Hargrove's formal complaint against Maya, the one that had initiated the performance review, was not just withdrawn. It was, per the Federal Review Team's recommendation, flagged in the hospital's own governance documentation as an example of the kind of complaint that had contributed to a compromised safety environment. He would not be sanctioned by the hospital for it, which Maya thought was probably the right call and definitely the unsatisfying one. He would, however, be required to complete a formal remediation process focused on clinical staff communication and the appropriate use of administrative authority. He came to tell her this himself, which she had not expected. I requested the remediation, he said. Not quite how she'd imagined those words ever coming out of his mouth, standing at the nursing station on a quiet Friday afternoon. I want you to know it wasn't something the board mandated. She looked at him. Why are you telling me that? Because it matters whether I'm doing it because I was told to. She thought about that. It was a more honest self-awareness than she had credited him with. And are you, she asked, doing it because you were told to? He held her gaze without flinching, which was more than she'd have predicted 48 hours ago. No. She nodded once. Okay. It was not absolution. It was not the rewriting of 14 months. It was a man standing at the start of a longer process and being honest about where he was at the beginning of it, and she thought that was about as much as this particular moment could hold. Patricia Vole resigned on Saturday. The resignation letter, which circulated among the senior nursing staff through the informal channel that all resignation letters traveled, cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other professional directions. It did not mention the federal review. It did not mention the performance review. It did not mention anything specific at all, which was consistent with how Patricia Vole had handled most things, by softening them until their point was gone. Maya read the letter once and then set it aside. The administrative machinery that had been used against her was disassembling itself piece by piece, and she found that she felt less about each piece than she would have expected. Not numb, just emptied of the specific anger she had been carrying, which it turned out had not been the main thing supporting her. The anger had been the noise. The work had always been the structure underneath it. She worked a full shift on Saturday because the hospital still needed nurses, and she was still a nurse, and the two things had not become less true because of everything else that was also true. The formal public statement from Ironwood Valley Medical Center came on Monday morning, distributed to local press, and simultaneously posted to the hospital's communications channels. It had been drafted by the board's communications team with significant input from the federal review team, which was why it was less evasive than institutional public statements usually managed to be. It confirmed that the hospital had been the target of a coordinated federal-level security breach. It confirmed that the breach had been partially enabled by an internal actor, Aldrin, now in federal custody. It confirmed that the breach had been intercepted and neutralized by hospital staff working in coordination with federal personnel. It did not name Maya by name. The federal review team had determined that naming a former operator in a public document created its own security considerations. But the description of the staff member who had identified the breach, coordinated the response, and prevented the completion of the extraction was specific enough that anyone in the hospital who read it understood exactly who it referred to. Maya read the statement at the nursing station. Atlas was in the break room. She had a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her phone had been producing messages at a rate she was not accustomed to since Friday, when the story had started moving through the professional networks that connected former military personnel in ways that the public channels didn't fully reflect. She hadn't responded to most of them. She had responded to 3. A former unit colleague who had been looking for her for 8 months, a mentor from her early special operations years who had heard through a channel she couldn't identify, and Felicity Obi, the night shift technician she'd redirected to the radiology suite on the night it happened, who had sent a voice message rather than a text, and whose voice in the message had been unsteady in a way that had made Maya have to set the phone down for a minute before she could respond. She was still working through the implications of the call from Tusk's office, the conversation about her future professional direction, which had happened formally on Sunday, and which had been more complicated than she'd anticipated, and which was going to require her to make a decision she hadn't fully made yet. She was thinking about it when Dara appeared at the nursing station for the last time. "Look, I'm heading back to the field office," Dara said. "The case transfers to the prosecution team this week, and my part of the investigation is moving to the other 3 facilities. Have you made progress on the Hollow Network's primary objective?" "Some. Enough to be worried and not enough to be satisfied." Dara paused. "Fierro, the one from the server room. He's given us 2 more names above his level. Aldrin has given us documentation of payment transfers going back 22 months. The picture is developing, but not complete. Not close to complete." Maya nodded. She had known that would be the answer. Large operations didn't dissolve because one branch failed. They reconfigured. Dara picked up her bag from the chair beside the station. Then she put it down again. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to let me say it without deflecting it, because I know that's what you'll try to do." Maya looked at her. "What you did on Wednesday night. Not just the tactical piece, not just the server room, but all of it. The year before it. Working in this building, doing this job, being treated the way you were treated, and not walking away." Dara held her gaze. That took a different kind of strength than the kind that comes with a briefing and a team and a clear objective. "And I don't know how you sustained it." Maya was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't," she said. "More than once." "I know. That's what I mean." Dara picked up her bag again. "You stayed anyway." She left without making it into a bigger moment than that, which Maya appreciated, because Dara had always understood that the things that mattered most didn't need ceremony. Yeah. The decision about Tusk's offer took her 4 more days. She worked through those 4 days the way she'd worked through all the days at Ironwood Valley, present, specific, attentive to the thing directly in front of her. She took care of the patients who arrived in the emergency department. She wrote the documentation that needed writing. She covered the shifts that needed covering. She sat with Marcus Trent when he came back for his concussion follow-up and told her he'd been thinking about applying to a federal law enforcement training program. And she told him that was a reasonable thing to think about, and meant it. She walked Atlas every morning in the park 3 blocks from her apartment, in the early dark before the city had fully woken up, and she thought about what she was. Not who she had been in the army, not who she had been told she was in the hospital, but what she actually was, stripped of the context that had tried to define her from the outside. She was someone who moved toward emergencies rather than away from them. She was someone who mapped every space she entered and noticed what didn't fit. She was someone who was made for work that required her to hold clinical precision and tactical awareness in the same hands simultaneously, in situations where other people were still figuring out that there was a situation. She was, it turned out, exactly the thing the last 14 months had tried to reduce her to not being. On Friday morning, she called the number Tusk had given her and told him her answer, Sam. The transition was not immediate. Federal processes moved at the speed of bureaucracy, which was to say slower than she would have preferred and faster than she'd feared. She worked her remaining nursing shifts at Ironwood Valley with the knowledge that they were remaining shifts, and she was surprised to find that the knowledge made them feel larger rather than smaller, the particular weight of things you know you are doing for the last time. Her last official shift at Ironwood Valley Medical Center was a Thursday, 6 weeks after the night it all broke open. She worked 12 hours, and they were ordinary hours, an MI in Bay 4 that responded well to intervention, a pediatric respiratory case that required careful monitoring, a 20-year-old with a hand injury from a kitchen accident who was more embarrassed than hurt and who she made laugh twice by accident, which she considered a reasonable outcome. She did not make a production of leaving. She completed her documentation. She cleaned out the small bottom drawer of the nursing station that had become, over 14 months, a repository of the particular personal detritus that accumulates in a space you occupy daily. The spare granola bars, the extra pen, the photograph she had printed, and then never put anywhere in particular of Atlas in the park, caught mid-stride, ears forward, tail up, moving like something that had decided to exist fully and completely and without apology. She put the photograph in her bag. She said goodbye to the night shift technician who arrived at handoff, and to Dr. Solis, who found her in the corridor and shook her hand and said something about the hospital being worse off for losing her, which she thought was probably true, and also probably not enough of a reason to stay. She almost got all the way to the exit without incident. Hargrove caught her at the main entrance doors. He was carrying something, a small package, wrapped without particular skill, the kind of wrapping job done by someone who did not wrap things often. He held it out. She took it. It was a book. She could feel the shape through the paper. She looked at him. "I didn't know what else to give someone who's better at every job than anyone around her," he said. "So it's a book about trauma medicine in austere environments. It's probably not—" He stopped. "It's probably not something you need." She unwrapped one corner. It was a clinical reference text she didn't own, which was not something she would have predicted. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and decided against it, which was, she thought, growth of a specific and useful kind. She went through the doors. Atlas was in the car. She put the book on the back seat and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine off. Ironwood Valley Medical Center was behind her in the rearview mirror. The lit entrance, the ambulance bay, the particular glow of a building that never fully slept. She had come here 14 months ago looking for solid ground and had found it, eventually, in a more complicated form than she'd been looking for. The ground had held. It had held because she had stood on it and refused to be moved even when everything around her was trying to move her, and it had cost her things she was still accounting for. The particular tiredness that didn't come from a single night, the hours she had spent in this parking garage alone with a dog and her hands not quite steady. She did not regret staying. That was the thing she'd worked out on the morning walks in the dark. Not whether it had been worth it in the transactional sense, whether the outcome justified the cost, whether the right things had eventually happened. Those calculations missed the point. The point was that she had stayed because leaving would have meant agreeing with the people who said she didn't belong, and she had never been able to make herself agree with things that were wrong, even when they were easier, even when no one was watching, especially then. She started the car, and pulled out of the parking lot. The federal program that Tusk had described was called the Integrated Medical Security Initiative, a pilot program connecting former military medical operators with federal facility protection frameworks, specifically in healthcare contexts, where the intersection of medical intelligence and physical security created vulnerabilities that conventional approaches weren't designed to address. In practice, what it meant was this. She would be doing the work she had been doing at Ironwood Valley, but with the institutional backing that work had always deserved. She would be embedded in facilities, not always hospitals, sometimes other healthcare-adjacent institutions, in a role that looked like one thing from the outside and was another thing entirely from the inside. She would have the clearances she needed, the resources she needed, the team she needed. Atlas was formally designated as a working partner, with documentation that the hospital's HR department had never been equipped to process. She started on a Monday. The facility was different. The work was the same in the ways that mattered. Move toward the emergency, map the space, notice what doesn't fit, use what you know, stay. When staying is the right call. Be the person in the room who has already thought about what comes next. Don't announce yourself. Don't need the announcement. She had spent 11 years building a specific set of capabilities in conditions that had required her to be invisible, and then 2 years trying to fit those capabilities into a context that kept insisting they weren't there. She understood now that the invisibility had never been the problem. The problem was when the people who were supposed to be on her side couldn't see past it. She had no patience left for that particular problem, and enough experience to know she never needed to accept it again. 3 months after she left Ironwood Valley, the federal prosecution of Curtis Aldrin produced its first major courtroom development. The charges, conspiracy to commit federal data theft, obstruction of a witness protection program, and 2 counts of criminal facilitation, were serious enough that the plea negotiations Aldrin's attorneys had been attempting collapsed when the prosecution added a 4th charge derived from Fierro's testimony. The hearing was reported in the regional press and picked up nationally by outlets covering federal organized crime cases. The Hollow Network's operational profile, partially declassified for the prosecution, was described in coverage as a sophisticated, long-running intelligence-gathering operation. The Ironwood Valley extraction attempt was cited as the operation's first significant failure point, the node where the plan had not held. Maya read the coverage on her phone during a break between assignments and then put her phone away. Deborah Rice entered a guilty plea on reduced charges 4 months after the arrest. The reduction reflected the coercive circumstances of her involvement. The sentencing was 18 months, suspended, with 3 years of supervised release and a requirement to cooperate with the ongoing federal investigation. She would not return to nursing. Maya sat with that for a long time. Not with satisfaction, not with relief, with the specific human complexity of a situation that had no clean resolution on the personal level, even as it resolved cleanly on the legal one. She had been wronged by Deborah. Deborah had been wronged by Aldrin. Aldrin had been operating on behalf of something larger and more deliberate and more cold than any of the individuals inside it. The chain of harm ran in both directions and did not terminate neatly at any single point. She had decided that she was not going to spend energy being angry about the parts that couldn't be assigned to a single target. She was going to do her job, which was to reduce the number of people who ended up inside those chains of harm in the first place. It was not a perfect resolution. It was a human one. 6 months after the night. The emergency room doors blew open. Maya was in a different city, working a different assignment, when she got a message from Marcus Trent. He had been accepted to the federal law enforcement training program. He wrote it in 3 sentences, very direct, the way people wrote things when they were proud of them but weren't sure whether to be. And the last sentence said, "You told me I had the right information. I've been thinking about that a lot." She read it twice and wrote back, "That's good. Be better than the situation every time. Don't wait to be told." Then she pocketed her phone and went back to work. An Atlas moved at her heel through an unfamiliar building, and she did what she had always done. She mapped it. Exit points, structural cover, lines of sight, the cameras and what they covered and what they didn't. The doors that locked and the ones that didn't. The people moving through the space and the particular geometry of how they moved. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The people who had tried to convince her otherwise had turned out to be wrong in ways that cost more than they'd been willing to admit. And that was their accounting to do, not hers. She was not interested in the credit. She was interested in the work. She was interested in being the person in the building who had already thought about what the building needed before the building knew it needed anything. The quiet variable that changed the outcome, the presence that didn't announce itself, the capability that existed whether or not anyone in the room had chosen to see it. She had spent 14 months being treated like she was less than she was. She had spent those same 14 months being exactly what she was. The difference between those two facts was not something the people who treated her that way had ever been able to touch. They had managed the surface, the job title, the shift assignment, the paper trail of manufactured inadequacy. But underneath all of that, in the part of her that moved toward emergencies and mapped unfamiliar spaces and pressed two fingers to a wrist in the dark to count what was still there, she had remained completely and stubbornly herself. Nobody takes that from you. Not a hostile physician, not a compromised administrator, not an institution that has confused its own comfort with your diminishment. They take the job, the title, the position on the roster. They do not take the thing that made you worth diminishing in the first place. That part you carry with you. You carry it into every room, into every shift, into every situation where someone looks at you and decides you are not the most important person there. You carry it quietly, and you work, and you wait for the moment when the gap between what they think you are and what you actually are becomes impossible to ignore. And then you walk through it. Atlas pushed his head against her left hand as they moved through the corridor, and she ran her fingers once over his ear. The torn one. The one that had its own story from a country she didn't talk about. And then she straightened and kept walking, deeper into a building that didn't know yet what it had just let through its doors. It would find out. They always